Now, Michael, I wanted to ask you, because, I took a very strong line last week while you and the rest of the good people of Victoria were locked in your house for barely few cases. They were all, funnily enough, all clustered around 5 local government areas in the northwest of Melbourne, only one across in Greater Dandenong, nothing in regional Victoria. So I went pretty hard because it seemed pretty obvious here you could deal with the spot fire without putting out the whole state. But John Ferguson, who I like reading in the Australian newspaper, has commented today saying, lay off Victoria, it's still bleeding. Now, he talks about a cultural feeling that essentially when you are in Victoria, there is a different way of processing this than being outside of Victoria. Now, as a bloke who can't stand the Premier, to that phenomena first of when people in Sydney, Brisbane, Canberra or anywhere else are pointing their finger at the failings of insert state government, do you think that people who are citizens of that state generally go, mate, piss off, I'm not interested. Unless you're literally sitting in Melbourne, don't talk about it.
So, mate, what's happened is this. The whole world, and talk about from Australia's point of view, Australians see what's happening overseas with the pandemic breakouts. They are absolutely scared out of their wits about what might happen to them, their families, etc. So they're gravitating towards strength. So any state government showing great strength, doesn't matter what damage they do to the economy, people put their health first. So no matter what smashing of the Victorian economy Andrews has done, he's getting away with it because people are gravitating towards strength, because the opposition's state or federal can't do anything about the pandemic, so they gravitate towards government because they want the governments to succeed. So that's why the Western Australian bloke will win, Palaszczuk won the territories, etc. But here's the thing, that in Victoria, even though people still gravitate to Andrews, there will be a day of reckoning for him, because people are starting to realise down here that if I look at Berejiklian, she just closes down the northern beaches and the surrounding suburbs of Greater Sydney, not the whole of New South Wales. Whereas Andrews panicked last week, as we know. He closed down the whole state for about 5 cases, hundreds and hundreds of miles away. He closed down the whole of country Victoria. People weren't within a bull's roar of the virus. They had to have the shops closed, mask wearing, no one to the homes, etc., etc. The full lockdown. This has caused an economic catastrophe in Victoria. And when JobKeeper starts running out at the end of March and the assistance that governments are providing to keep the economies going runs out, mate, Victoria is going to be an economic basket case, and that's when people are going to start saying Andrews was not an award winner or nominee, but the worst premier we've seen in this country for many, many decades.
James, I think one of the many political calculations in all of this is that for the state leaders who are facing elections like what's happened in Western Australia, Queensland, all the rest, right, which is win on the strength of incumbency, bugger the economy, because the economy will be a political problem for the Prime Minister if there was an election at the end of this year or sometime next year. For Daniel Andrews, I know we're a couple of years away from a state election, so I'm not entirely sure whether that works the same way. But the first chance to get the baseball bats in an electoral sense is going to be a federal election end of this year, sometime next year. Is there a calculation here that, look, bugger the regions, because even if we've got a couple of seats there, we're going to pick up and we're going to even spread even further across the suburbs of Melbourne? Or did you notice something different last week than the last time around when people couldn't leave their house due to public policy failures, which, if we had talked about this in January of 2020 or 19 or 18, I would have told you if a public policy failure led to zero accountability, 800 people dead and millions of people stuck in their house, the approval rating for that person would be -20. What do you think?
Paul, a lot of different points to pick up there. First and foremost, I'm a big fan of federalism, but the way in which federalism is practiced in Australia has some fundamental flaws, and one of those is that state governments are not held accountable for the performance of their economies by and large. They're not held accountable for the performance managing a budget by and large, and that's because they're largely dependent on their revenue from the federal government. They're very accustomed and well trained in complaining about getting sufficient revenue from the federal government, and their revenue doesn't rise or fall that much based on economic performance, and their voters don't judge them for it, so they don't take as much of an interest in it. They know that ultimately it's a Prime Minister that picks up the tab both electorally and financially. On the regions and shutting down the regions in the way that the Premier did last week in a very callous way, I think probably there is a bit of truth to what you're saying in that kind of bugger the region sentiment, because Victoria is a highly centralised state. Most of our population is in and around Melbourne. The Labor Party does hold a number of regional seats, but even if the Liberal Party won every single regional seat that it doesn't currently hold at the next election with our National Party colleagues, that still wouldn't be enough to take us to government because of the number of seats that we lost in metropolitan Melbourne at the last state election. And that's even before the redistribution, which probably makes things even worse than it is for the Liberal Party at the state level in metropolitan Melbourne. So Daniel Andrews knows, with his dominance of the west and the north of Melbourne, which are the growing parts of Melbourne, that he doesn't have to worry too much about the rest of Victoria and can still be re-elected. And that is a very sobering thought for the Liberal Party.